Hi, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. Uh, so I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work. At present, I'm on Gandangara land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Um, I'm not sure how to start today because it's something that I have been thinking of for a while, and as always, Border Criminologies has given me an opportunity to think about it a little bit more and to develop my ideas, which have mostly been in the realm of conversation with a number of members in Border Criminologies, but also my colleagues in India and Australia, some of whom are here today. So I'd like to start with taking a look at intersectionality and Southern epistemologies. So, the discussion on the epistemic side of the Global South epistemologies by Euro American contexts is not a new one. Several researchers from different parts of the world have argued for an epistemic agency in the different spaces of knowledge production. Now, these discussions have been broadly located in post-colonial studies, decolonization theories, subaltern studies, to name a few. Feminists have also argued for an epistemic agency in the context of androcentrism in the process of knowledge production. Now, each of these discussions have created spaces for dialogue and participation. What I'd like to do today is nuance those discussions to look at the researcher and the research subject from the Global South closely to understand how they participate in the process of knowledge production in criminology of mobility. I argue that criminology of mobility may widen its scope by integrating voices from Global South as an intersection in its epistemological considerations. I locate my own experience as someone who has immensely benefited from using the framework of criminology of mobility, especially when I began understanding the lives of Bangladeshi women in prisons in India, who were largely invisible even within the Indian context. Hence, I value the conversations across borders, and I'm in no way today suggesting that these conversations are not beneficial for our work or for the lives of the communities we work with. But I'm suggesting ways to nuance this and to engage in retooling so that the knower and what is known from the Global South can claim an epistemic agency, both in their own context as well as in the global context. Now, at the outset, I'd like to clarify that I'm not an unruptured voice of the Global South. I acknowledge the difference in terms of history, sociocultural context, geopolitics, international relations. And in fact, I can only claim to be one of the many voices from India, given its diversity and the complex realities. I'm conscious of my location and of privilege in these conversations and how it gives me leverage and power. How I use this privilege and power becomes crucial to my contribution in the field of criminology of mobility. Now, in terms of understanding intersectionality, I look at intersectionality as how Patricia Hills Collins puts it, as a knowledge project whose purpose lies in its attentiveness to power relations and social inequalities. She posits intersectionality as a field of study, intersectionality as an analytical strategy, and as praxis. Cho, Crenshaw, and McCall too have alluded to the importance of focusing on what intersectionality does rather than what it is. I posit intersectionality as an epistemological question and ask how intersectionality can be used as a tool to hear diverse voices from the Global South. While I argue for an intersectional perspective, I bear in mind the debate on the imperialization of the concept of intersectionality. And I'm not using it uncritically, hence. But in support of intersectionality, there have been feminists in India who've said, for instance, Mary John, who said that it is true that given our colonial and post-colonial histories, our intellectual spaces are cluttered with false universalisms. But it's equally true that we have been trapped by false particularisms and even false rejections of the universal. Hence, intersectionality should not become a universal frame to fix people's identities at certain intersections. Individuals are not carrying the same intersections of their identities. Sometimes one identity may take over another. The combination of identities may change. Identities are in a flux. It is important to integrate the intersections, but it is also important to understand the ways in which power relations between the different categories of these intersections change. This will help us prioritize our goals for action. As a researcher, then it becomes important to identify the different moments and spaces in which those identities are lived and represented. For instance, the Bangladeshi women that I researched with in prison in India, they sometimes wanted to be identified as Bangladeshi prisoner, sometimes as a female prisoner, and sometimes as a Bangladeshi female prisoner, thus claiming agency in the way they wanted to represent themselves and a combination of which identities they wanted to foreground. Now, taking epistemology as the starting point, I discuss the different aspects of knowledge production, not necessarily in a linear pattern, but as different aspects of our academic engagement. Let's first look at the research subject from the Global South. I discussed the example of the Bangladeshi women I worked with in prisons in India. And just to give a context, the Bangladeshi women were in prisons in India because they crossed the border without valid documents. The women I worked with were in prison under the Foreigners Act, and they could be in prison from 2 to 8 years. But the Passports Act is also used in different states to imprison people who come without documents into the country. The Bangladeshi women diverged from the dominant legal view of states as distinct identities, a normative perspective in which borders demarcate nation states. Their narratives of how they understood borders and visualized two countries was drawn from or based on a variety of factors. The stories that they had heard in Bangladesh, the frequency of travel they had witnessed between the two places, or knowledge that they had gained through mass media. While they recognized the difference between India and Bangladesh, for them, this variance was not neatly marked or divided by a border, but it was more in terms of culture, religion, and economics. But this difference did not necessarily translate to an understanding of two countries as distinctly separate from each other or as having political borders. Their reference point for understanding the difference between the two countries was not a printed map. It was based on conversations and lived experiences. These women were not exposed to the jargon of the state, but they were trying to create their own vocabulary, which varied from individual to individual. Their experiences illustrate how the colonial and androcentric abstract construction of borders has serious implications in disempowering them and therefore deepening their marginalization. The perspectives of these women offer an advantageous view from which one can see the arbitrariness, the paradoxes, and contradictions involved in the criminalization of border crossing and within the construction of the border itself. Their narratives may provide criminology of mobility, important directions and useful insights into alternative ways of understanding state sovereignty and governance. Their struggles and negotiations give us an insight into the everyday life of power and the systems of oppression that it creates and maintains. Scholars and activists of criminology of mobility can use these to bring about a change in the existing structures. Can the Bangladeshi women's experiences of crossing the India-Bangladesh border provide an understanding of women's embodied experience of crossing the border in different parts of the world? Their construction of spaces of incarceration around the mango tree, of fear, of violation of honor, and the experiences of love can inform our understanding of embodied experiences of asylum seekers, detainees elsewhere as well. Now, the narratives of the Bangladeshi women in prison in India offer a view not only to their lives, but also throw light on the complexities in the South Asian context and provide alternatives to globally assumed constructs of borders and penal institutions. The voices of the Bangladeshi women is useful not only for understanding the South Asian context, but also other contexts where similar conditions of marginalization may be limiting women's abilities to thrive. Now let's look at the researcher from the Global South and the practices of academic engagement. Santos, in his book, Epistemologies of the South, Justice Against Epistemicide, argues that first, the understanding of the world far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. Second, there's no global justice without global cognitive justice. And third, the emancipatory transformations in the world may follow grammar and scripts other than those developed by Western-centric critical theory, and such diversity should be valorized. Now, epistemicide may take place in several ways, such as, and I'm speaking with respect to some of the academic practices. It could be exclusion through the peer review process, discriminatory editorial decision-making, inequitable research collaborations, selective invitation to conferences, inclusion of the researcher or the research subject from the Global South as merely a case study, or in the context of data collection and management. Now, I'm just going to speak about two of these issues today. And the first one that I speak about is data and guesstimates and how that impacts work in the Global South. Now, international data on different kinds of mobilities, which are based on a quantitative methodology, which does not take into consideration the particularities of border control and mobility in the Global South, can have deeply damaging impact on the work that is being done at the grassroots. A pertinent example would be the Trafficking in Persons report and its ranking of countries. While the developed countries are concerned about trafficking mostly in the context of trying to curb illegal migration, for developing countries, there is either a worry of the celebritization of human trafficking, or there is a lot of funding which comes into the developing country for work around human trafficking, but then it comes with an agenda that you need to follow and need to fit into parameters that are required for international agencies. Or it results in a lack of attention by the local governments for fear of retribution by the international community. For instance, India's position in the Tier 2 watch list of the Trafficking in Persons report has ramifications for the internal politics of the country and intended policy reforms. The numerical projections or the guesstimates made by the US Trafficking in Persons report or such other international publications do not take into account the nuances of the regional context of people's experiences. The ranking of countries without taking into account regional specificities only serves the purpose of building a political discourse without any focus on praxis. It prevents local political action by governments in order to resist global naming and shaming. This naming and shaming shifts the focus on specific countries and regions which are seen to be weak and in need of prioritizing the anti-trafficking agenda, and creates international pressure. the geopolitics and structural factors which contribute to the weakness, so-called weakness, of a certain country or a state are sidelined. So this trafficking story in the developing world then remains one that is defined by the developed world. So that's one of the ways in which we can prevent work in the global south by virtue of the way we collect data and the way we project data. The other aspect that I want to talk about is the politics of peer review. And I had some really interesting discussions about this, even within border criminologies and my colleagues and peers in India. And in fact, for this presentation, I did call up a number of them to try and see if what I'm saying makes sense, because a lot of these conversations happen to be corridor conversations or something that you don't really speak about in formal spaces. So I did actually collect a few of the quotes from some of my colleagues and some of them are there on the slide. So what I'm saying is that peer review is a political act. It gives the reviewer immense power to either completely discourage a piece of work or to provide opportunities for it to flourish. Hence, it needs to adopt a language of empowerment, whether or not the relationship established for a piece of publication is continued. Peer review cannot be presented as a stream of consciousness or a series of impatient comments. It is important to acknowledge the complexities of post-colonial writing and writing from a post-colonial context while providing feedback. This is only possible if we attempt to first understand each other's frames of reference and not to try to put everything under the same format of writing, which is referred to as the standard or conventional academic writing practice. The comments and revisions suggested compel authors or researchers from Global South to untangle the complexities and provide explanations for realities which have no straightforward trajectories. They are advised either to use the post-colonial theory, as that will best explain their realities, or why don't you refer to readings from the Indian context? When they end up using readings from the Indian context, they are advised to refer to a reading which will inevitably direct them to a piece of work in Europe or North America. This limits the author's ability to choose the framework which they think will best fit their narrative. Commonly used comments which come up is reword or rephrase. Now, when they're mentioned against a grammatically and syntactically correct statement, it has very little to offer. It merely indicates a preference for a word which best fits the academic convention followed by the reviewer, without leaving too much room for a dialogue. Some reviewers also make reference to the reader and how we need to write differently so that the readers can learn about our complexities. And I quote, "You have some great stuff in there. Expand on it and dumb it down. Not because your reader is dumb, but because we are learning about this fascinating issue." Close quote. Or, I quote again, "Remember that your reader is totally ignorant of most of this information. So break it down and keep it simple." I ask, who is this reader? And why is the labor of translation assigned to the authors from Global South? For how long are they going to footnote partition of India, India-Bangladesh border, caste, joint family system in their articles? Eager to engage with a larger audience, authors do tend to give detailed descriptions of their context, and then they are reminded that this is too descriptive, or these are stories, or is this information necessary? How much description is enough description? I argue that while it is important that we engage with larger readership and explain different contexts to each other, it cannot be done at the expense of oversimplifying complexities. Learning about each other's context is a two-way process and not the burden of the Global South researchers. Voices from the Global South need to be present in their own terms. They cannot be seen as victims that need saving, need to be educated about academic convention since they are incomprehensible. They need to be seen, they need to be heard. Efforts need to be made to loosen out epistemic fixities in order to fracture the homogeneity and hegemony that often accompanies academic convention. If criminology of mobility questions borders and systems which govern mobilities, then it needs to look beyond a limited spatialized understanding of where knowledge is produced and who produces this knowledge, lest it becomes representative of the same surveillance systems it challenges. Can experiences of researchers from Global South be integrated while drafting the research questions and while making decisions around what can be known? Can they participate in universal knowledge production processes through their experiences of particularity and vice versa? Now, how do we retool? And what do we mean by retooling? An intention for meaningful engagement can help build sustainable relationships. There is a need for conversations and solidarities among researchers and research subjects in the Global South, as well as the researchers and the research subjects in the Global South and Global North. It is important to break local and global boundaries, but also to work with particularities. While having these discussions, it is important to question the researcher and research subject dichotomy. There are research projects where people with lived experience are invited on research projects as researchers. This is an important step as it questions the hegemony of the process of knowledge production and what counts as knowledge. Can the narratives of the Bangladeshi women on borders inform scholars from Global North when they frame their research? In the border narratives of the Bangladeshi women is a resistance to colonial borders. These voices of resistance can join the voices of resistance to borders in the Global North, leading to a polyphony of voices against the tyranny of borders. Histories of resistances to colonial borders have important contributions for contemporary resistance to borders all over the world. With resistance, there is also a reconceptualization and alternative to borders. Women's experiences have been historically marginalized on the pretext that they are based on emotions and hence irrational, inappropriate, and undesirable for theory. And I quote Shefali Moitra, where she says that in the name of neatness and efficiency, the existence of fuzzy categories are either denied or mutated or marginalized and silenced. Realities are complex and incoherent. We provide them meaning through what we understand as coherent. Embracing complexity, uncertainty, and incoherency in narratives will open the door for a more meaningful dialogue between the Global South and the Global North. This will necessitate thinking outside the Western modernist box of empiricism and rationality and trying out combinations of different tools to trace different trajectories. Use of creative methodologies, such as the audiovisual medium, artwork, podcasts, can be some tools to engage and communicate knowledge in non-conventional ways. And I'm aware that border criminologies and a number of members of the border criminologies have already started engaging in some of these and using some of these mediums. Reflexivity will be an important tool to locate ourselves within intersectional positions of power. We will need to work out our tools based on the relationships of trust and mutuality we create with partners we work with. This will emerge with acknowledging codependence of the Global South and the Global North, but also a sense of autonomy for the Global South. Supporting struggles against identities, citizenship, belongingness across borders can prove to be powerful expressions of solidarity. I embarked on this discussion with the intention of engaging in a constructive dialogue and to collectively reimagine how we may make spaces and practices of knowledge production more equitable. Some of us might want to argue that we cannot break the master's house with the master's tools, and some of us might want to engage in retooling. I do not want to present a prescription for what will work for reimagining criminology of mobility, but want to lay bare various opportunities for us to come together and to think and experience alternatives. Now, this will depend on where we are willing to view reality from. The Bangladeshi women prisoners in India provide one standpoint. As a researcher, I provide another standpoint. An intersectional view of these standpoints may provide the scope of alternatives to the way we understand borders, policing, detention, and mobility across borders. It is not only about who we view and how we view, but where we view from. I'd like to quote Judith Butler, who says, "We do not need to love each other to engage in meaningful solidarity. Hear, feel, sense, extend, and I'd say hit the Google search button when in doubt." Voices from the Global South may not occupy all the canonical spaces of knowledge production, but there's a large body of material which is produced by and for the Global South. And I'd like to end with this quote and a question before we can open up for discussion. How do we reimagine the ethical and political responsibility of criminology of mobility? Or do we need to reimagine? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rimple. That was a great talk. And I'm only sorry that we're not doing this in person to have a round of applause. Although we do have some virtual applause for you. Thanks very much, guys. So Gabriella, would you mind responding to Rimple's presentation before we open up for a Q&A, please?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. And please excuse the voice. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed that this is just nothing but a sore throat. We'll find out in a couple of days if that's what it is. My name is Gabriella Sanchez, and I'm a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center at the European University in Florence. And once again, I thank all of you for being here, and also, of course, Mary, Rimple, and Sam, and Margie, who is unfortunately not joining us today, but who put all of this work so that we could all get together this morning, this afternoon, tonight, wherever you may be watching us from or joining from. And while I was listening to Rimple's remarks, there were, in fact, a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas that I started to think about. Because I see how we have been engaged in this conversation on intersectionality for a very long time. But I would like for us also to think, precisely, actually, I would rather also start at this very last question that Rimple threw at us. Where do we go from here? And I think this is a question that we have been asking, in our graduate seminars, in our conferences, in our conversations, because what Rimple brings up is something that we encounter every day. And not only in our experiences as researchers, but our experiences as policymakers, our experiences as people who join platforms or even groups, where that we perhaps don't see as political or as engaged, but where our stances, our positions, our observations as women, as people of color, as people who come from working class backgrounds, in my case as a migrant myself, how do we move from here? And this is because many of these conversations have been pretty static. And this is despite our willingness to engage with them critically. I love this last quote because I think this is in many instances even painful, because it implies how we have to be critical of our own stances and how we ourselves, as much aware as we can be about notions of intersectionality and reflexivity, how we are ourselves reproducing the very same practices that are keeping other people outside of the circles. And many times how in our efforts to be very critical, we ourselves are shutting down the paths for collaboration and for to create, in a sense, in a way, this spaces for to work together with people that we would probably not work with, in other instances. I thought about, trying to look at more specific examples, more concrete examples. There's two things that I've thought about during Rimble's presentation. One, precisely the case of the TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report, on how, as she mentioned, this has indeed set up patterns, for collaboration with countries, and not only for collaboration, for behavior, how countries are expected to behave and to act, how there's this processes of becoming disciplined or having to follow certain guidelines, but also how, and this is something that I'm sure many of you who are watching or who have followed or who are very much involved in any of these areas that we work in, mobility, smuggling, trafficking, criminology, how organizations on the ground, how NGOs rely on these sources of funding to survive, and how many of them are precisely set up by people who have this critical commitment to carry out the work. So I think one of the, for me, one of the most, it has been pretty challenging, but also very, what I consider one of my most important learning experiences has been getting closer to the people who work on TIP, on the development of the TIP report, on the people who work on the development of the smuggling, the global smuggling reports, organizations like UNODC, IOM, the US State Department. And this is something that, as a graduate student and perhaps initially as a newly minted PhD, I was always told or led to believe that we had to stay away from these organizations, that we had to develop our own resistance and show agency and try to stay away from them and try to counter their power. And for me, in terms of the work that we have collectively developed in the area of smuggling and trafficking, building on these challenges, on these differences, on these epistemological differences that we have with these organizations has been critical in advancing our work. And it has been very interesting and also very encouraging to see critical work that is being developed by people of color, by people from the Global South, being included in these reports, being part of these conversations. So I'm sharing this experience with the group because I think it is also important to find ways of, just being critical as well on how we ourselves are creating sometimes barriers to these collaborations and for these communications, and the value of drawing from them. The second and last example that I wanted to bring was precisely on the issue of peer reviewing. I'm sure that many of the people who are in the group have experienced this endless rejections or this pretty condescending responses that we often get from peer reviewers. And also explanations on how we should frame our work on, or how we should perhaps look for other places, that are more at our level, so that, kind of like telling us again, like, this is, learn, what your place is, and then once you know that, we may let you play. And here, once again, I see something that Rimpo mentioned is the power of solidarity, but also, again, a very strategic solidarity. because many times, again, we just stay at that level of the conversations and, oh, look at how critical we are. And yes, it's are the next steps, but we never get to materialize them. So I think, you know, when it comes to publications, the collective of researchers that we have also been able to put together, and the people who continue to join and to reach out to contribute on the work that we develop on smuggling, has precisely taken advantage of this kind of tensions, rather. Not only looking at how can we build solidarity, but where is the tension? And can we get to that, to those point of tensions through our work, through the empirical work? And how can solidarity be, once again, proactive and critical? Because I think that many times when people see external, you know, people from outside of some of the groups that we may form, is, oh, that's another group of women of color. Oh, look at them, they got together. That is so encouraging. Congratulations, I'm so happy that you finally came together. Like, we have been doing this for generations, so this is not something that we just suddenly discovered. So once again, trying to build new sorts of, not new, but more, look for, you know, I would actually go and call for, you know, the development of this points of tension, and how do we move them? How do we, it's like, you know, when you feel the tension in the muscle, how do you work through that? How, and a lot of this, and this is what I'm going to use to close, I think is something that the people we work with in the field teach us. And this is a lot that we can learn from their experiences. We work and we write about and we take advantage and we build our careers on the experiences of people who are incarcerated, people who are experiencing migration, people who have been systematically marginalized. And that those knowledge and those experiences, rather than only those of the circles of power, are the ones that we need to learn from. And also, again, incorporate them into our work and use them to push forward a more critical agenda that, again, is not looking into, you know, for conflict, but more into these points of, again, I'm repeating myself, points of tension where we can move and advance our knowledge, and not, once again, just being seen or perceived as another group of, you know, very smart and very intelligent people who come together looking for solutions. So I'll just leave it at that. And thank you so much again, Rimple, for your presentation.